Well, good evening, dear brothers and friends. It is certainly great to be with you for another Virtual Masonic Education series put on by the Rubicon Masonic Society. It is hard to believe that we are actually on our 65th virtual education tonight. It's been a great experience. I feel like we know all of you all in person, even though some of you are across the globe. And we appreciate you always being with us and showing your support, not only for the Rubicon Masonic Society, but more especially for Masonic education. So thank you very much for being with us this evening. Another special thanks, as always, to the William and Ware Lodge of Research and Lexington Lodge No. 1. Some great brothers in these lodges. If you ever get a chance to meet those brothers and come down to Lexington or come down to Kentucky, we will do our best to show you a good time. With that being said, let's jump right into the evening because we have a lot of great content to go through. We have a great presenter tonight. So, Worshipful Brother Chaplain Alan Martin, will you please deliver an opening devotion?
Brothers, let's pray. Grand Architect of the universe, we ask for your blessing this evening as we assemble to further explore Freemasonry. We pray for the blessing of your divine wisdom so we may be better enabled to understand and apply the principles of our craft as we endeavor to become better men and masons. Guide our conversation so we may be productive in all of our undertakings as we work for your great purposes through masonry. Amen.
So mote it be. Thank you, brother. Brethren and friends, as you know, our virtual Masonic education, it aims to help us to become better men, always devoted to our family, our faith, our neighbors, our country. May we all come together this evening to learn to subdue our passions, to discipline our minds, and to improve ourselves through the tools of Freemasonry. Any opinions expressed during this education will be those of the presenter or participant. They do not necessarily reflect the views of any lodge or Grand Lodge or Rubicon Masonic Society. By participating, you do consent to our full disclaimer, which can be found at rubiconmasonicsociety.com/disclaimer. As you all know, these are not tiled meetings. Masons and non-Masons are more than welcome to attend and participate, so just please always be mindful that anything discussed should be suitable for Masons of all degrees as well as non-Masons. Gentlemanly manners at all times, no smoking, no eating, no food, no alcohol permitted, no discussion of politics or religion. A few recommendations is please type your name and any appropriate Masonic title under your picture to identify yourself to others. If you're not a Mason, please simply type guest after your name. Please enable your video camera because most of you we would like to see. If not, you can leave it off. Please reduce any background noise and keep your microphone muted when not speaking. Remove other distractions, and as always, please be patient should any technical difficulties occur. Brethren and friends, we have a great presentation tonight. I'm very much looking forward to it personally. But Worshipful Brother Bizak, will you please do the appropriate honors of introducing our guest for the evening?
I will. Thank you, brother. Chris Ruli is a historian. He's a researcher on early American Freemasonry. He's the author of two books, The White House and Freemasons, and Brother Lafayette, which you'll be speaking about tonight. There's other publications that Chris has published, of course, examining the relationship between Freemasonry and politics, economics, and culture. His work it's appeared in popular print, television, social media, the Washington Post, on the History Channel, and dozens of other history-focused podcasts. He's a graduate of Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs, and he currently serves as director for two of the country's leading Masonic research institutions, the Scottish Rite Research Society and the Philalethes Society. He's the editor of the Plumb Line, the Scottish Rite Research Society Bulletin, and associate editor, too, of Heredom, the Society's research journal. Brother Ruli's also fellow of the Philalethes Society, and he currently serves as its third vice president. Brother Chris, we thank you for being with us this evening, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Brother John. Am I audible to all? Just want to make sure my audio is working.
Yes, you are.
Thank you so much, Worshipful. Brethren, good evening. and guests as well. Good evening. I'm very much pleased to be here tonight to talk with you about a person with whom I have spent a lot of time the last couple of years working on in terms of research and working on his biography, and then traveling throughout the country to speak about him, Brother Lafayette, Gilbert de Mortier, the Marquis de Lafayette. This year will be, or is, excuse me, the bicentennial of his last visit to the United States. And it is filled with many Masonic activities and many interesting events associated with Freemasonry. And so tonight rather, this video will capture a lot of the sort of general thoughts, a general summation of my research that has been sort of my focus for the last couple of years. If you permit me just several moments, I'm going to share my screen and share my slides. I hope I know that I was made a presenter here, so just bear with me as I do this. Apologies to all. Okay. I hope my screen is seen and it is available for all. Does everyone see my slide? The cover slide should say Brother Lafayette in America.
Looks great, Chris. You're all set.
Excellent. Thank you, Worshipful. All right. So I've had the pleasure of traveling throughout the country this year and talking about Marquis de Lafayette. He is an interesting character. For those of you who are not certainly familiar with Marquis de Lafayette, I'll certainly talk a little bit about him during this session, but I certainly encourage you all to do your own research and read up on him. He is a fascinating figure, a fascinating character in American Freemasonry and American history in general. I had the opportunity of traveling to Grand Lodge of New York. New Hampshire was about 2 weeks ago, talking about this book, which really is a composite or a catalog of Lafayette's Masonic activities from when we believe he was initiated to the end of his life. And so this really is what I believe the most detailed account of the Marquis de Lafayette's Masonic connection, his legacy with Freemasonry. And so I thought for the purposes of this presentation, perhaps we would take about 5 takeaways, 5 general points, if you will, of Brother Lafayette and my research. And so we can dive into the first one. So the first takeaway is Lafayette's legacy diminished over time. Now, what does that mean? Well, if you were a Mason in 1824, or perhaps in 1825, you certainly knew a lot about Marquis de Lafayette, Gilbert de Mortier. Now, of course, there were many Marquis, but we're focusing on this individual for now. And one of the things that you may have probably, I sort of jokingly antiquated or jokingly connect it with, the Marquis' visit to the United States in 1824 was sort of like Beatlemania in the United States in terms of popular culture. It was, a World Cup. It was the Olympics. It was politics, a national election all rolled up into one in terms of its interest, its engagement, how it impacted American society, how we discussed and talked about it in newspapers. And unfortunately, what I really discovered going through this research is I have found that his legacy has diminished over time. Most Masons, heck, I would venture to guess most people in the United States don't really know a lot about Lafayette, don't really know a lot about his experiences. And that's unfortunate, especially when we see how important he was in the Revolution, how important he was back in his own country, and then really what his legacy was with Freemasonry, which we'll talk about momentarily. I would venture to guess that most Americans, and perhaps most Masons as well, this is what they see when they think of Lafayette, or perhaps what they see in popular culture. This young officer, 16, 17 years old, who comes to the United States, causes an international incident the minute he gets on the boat to come to the United States, because the French king, ironically, told Lafayette, you are not allowed to come to the United States and engage in this war during the Revolution. You will not drag France into this war. And of course, those of you who know a little bit about American history will certainly understand why that is so interesting and ironic. But the minute Lafayette arrives in the United States with a piece of paper, a letter of introduction by Benjamin Franklin himself to the Continental Congress, Lafayette gets involved in the revolution. He, unlike his contemporaries, unlike other, let's see, how would I see it? Soldiers for hire or soldiers for fortune, like von Steuben, like Casimir Polansky, like many of these other generals who came from Europe who were interested in glory and the riches of the New World. Lafayette came to the United States as a student in a sense. He came, and one of the things that he did to ingratiate himself with Washington is during a tour of Washington's camp, Washington was slightly disappointed at the construction, the format, the layout, the way and the manner in which the camp was laid out and how his men were engaging in the camp. And he seemed to apologize to Lafayette about its condition. And Lafayette said, paraphrasing, General, I'm here to learn. I'm not here to, teach or guide. And so as a student, he really certainly ingratiated himself to Washington, and Washington appreciated the support. Washington was also a smart man. He realized that this young French officer, or now a major general in the Continental Congress, had lots of value in terms of engaging with the French, engaging with the local states. You must remember, if you're familiar with the American Revolution, you have to certainly understand that the states basically sent the Continental Army supplies and provisions at an ad hoc basis. Some states did not submit anything. They did not donate any troops, did not donate any funds. And so Washington was constantly dealing with supply issues, logistics issues. And so Lafayette served really the first part of the revolution as in clerical positions, sending letters, inviting states to come contribute monies. And then over time, it shifted to more battlefield work. I would venture to guess that most Americans, this is the Lafayette they know. I would argue that most Americans don't really know what happened after the revolution. Of course, Lafayette later on in the war serves as more of a leader in combat. He pins Cornwallis at Yorktown. This provides Washington enough time to get to Yorktown to basically end the war then and there. And so most people, I would argue, really don't know what happened afterwards when Lafayette returns back to France. He is hailed as a hero, of course, and he immediately gets involved in the French Revolution. Unfortunately, Lafayette was part of, a French dynasty, the monarchy. Of course, he was part of that, sphere, that environment. He knew Marie Antoinette well. He knew the king well. He was certainly part of the social class that ruled France. And so he was put into an uncomfortable position, of course. Imagine you're part of the monarchy, but you are also interested in shifting the government, doing something that's never been done ever in the history of the world. What would happen in the United States, shifting it over from a monarchy over to a republic. And now in Lafayette's perhaps youth and inexperience, or perhaps the issue of youth being he thought he could do something that's never done before and do it once more in France. And so he got himself in an uncomfortable position. I would argue he alienated both sides by trying to appease both sides. On one end, he was trying to shift the French monarchy over to what we would now call a constitutional monarchy, something that we see in England and France today, England and Spain today, where the country has a figurehead, but they effectively are doing ceremonial duties. And then, of course, on the other end, you have Maximilien Robespierre, you have the revolutionaries who said, listen, kid, you might be part of the system. Yeah, you helped, create foster the revolution in the United States, but this thing about constitutional monarchy, it's not enough. We're moving forward with a full, republic, and we've got to kick these guys out. And so in an attempt to appease both sides, Lafayette makes an enemy of both sides. At one point, Lafayette is made what I would sort of equivalent of being a chief of police for Paris, the city of Paris. And unfortunately, at one demonstration, his officers shoot on protesters, causing great political distress, causing, untold damage to his career, as well as, of course, the death of countless lives. This prompts Maximilien Robespierre to label him a traitor, labels Lafayette a traitor to the cause. There is unfortunately a mob that goes to his house. They burn his house down. They try to find Lafayette, and fortunately for Lafayette and his family, they flee out of Paris, and he is sort of in a diminished position. There is hope, of course. He attempts to flee, and he sort of heads northeast into what we now, Belgium. Unfortunately, at the time, he is captured by Austrian forces. His family and himself are captured by Austrian forces because during the revolution, or at least this part of the revolution, France, the new French government, decides to, in the midst of a revolution, declare war on Austria. It's sort of the equivalent of the Confederate States not only declaring war on the Union, but then saying, we don't like these, the Mexican country as well, so let's declare war on Mexico. In other words, it was a terrible decision. And so Lafayette, unfortunately, is captured. He spends 5 years in prison. His wife is effectively negotiating with the government to try to secure his release. His son, George Washington Lafayette, is sent over, smuggled effectively over to the United States, and George Washington Lafayette stays with his namesake, so he can, to secure in the fear that his family line would be killed, and so, Lafayette is certainly in a diminished position. Meanwhile, he loses all his titles, all the money, all these ranks and honors, and all the things that made him this young, dashing officer of the revolution. He lost it. And so to me, this is the Lafayette that I think about, who in 1824 is making this tour. I don't think a lot of Americans know about this point in his life. He's released from prison after 5 years by a person of very little consequence. You've probably never heard of him, a guy named Napoleon Bonaparte. He secures Lafayette's release, and Lafayette spends effectively the rest of his political career in France attempting to recoup his financial position, his titles, his ranks, all the things that were lost to him. He is now attempting to spend his time trying to recapture. And so, unfortunately, he is mostly destitute. He doesn't have these ranks or titles anymore. He operates as per a condition of one of his releases. He operates under a sort of quiet politics or unsuccessful politics. If he does try to attempt to ferment revolution, it doesn't work. And so Lafayette effectively becomes a minor character in the French Revolution, or the latter stage of the French Revolution. And so by 1823, when we're now a couple decades away from the revolution, Lafayette, as you see in this very nice depiction that I think of Lafayette, he's in his 70s. He has very little money. The titles that he has are gone. And he is effectively attempting to recoup or try to live his life with his children and his family, and try to steer his course into a way where, his legacy isn't at all diminished. It is around this time, and we are now getting close to the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, the signing and the formation of the United States, where Lafayette receives a letter by James Monroe, President James Monroe, and Congress, effectively inviting him to come to the United States to participate in what they are thinking of as a social, goodwill tour of the United States. And so the invitation was, please come to the United States. Please talk about the revolution. There are very few, but there were about 4 founding fathers left. Lafayette was the last major general of the Continental Army, and so there was an attempt to bring him back to the United States to bring back some of that mysticism, that lore, that interest about the sort of founding generation. And you'd be surprised to hear, but one of the other reasons was because there was so much political infighting going on in Washington and throughout the country, that they thought having Lafayette come and talk about the revolution may foster some goodwill to improve the state of politics in the United States. I'll hold off on any other additional commentary about that. But the idea was, let's bring him back. Lafayette is not interested. Not interested. I can't afford it. I'm certainly not interested in traveling that far. He was now 76, 77. And the thought, of course, of traveling from France over to the United States, 24 states, 7,000 miles, and no highway system. This is very difficult and arduous travel. Certainly did not make it appealing to Lafayette. The other thing, and perhaps the most glaring issue, was he couldn't afford it. He couldn't afford. He was in debt before he came to the United States during the tour, and so he could not even afford to fathom how to pay for a trip with his son, his secretary, and himself traveling again to 24 states, 7,000 miles across 13 months. It was it was just too much of an ordeal for Lafayette. And so when news of Lafayette's initial decision to say, you know what, I don't think this is a good idea, Monroe and Congress basically make him an offer that he certainly did not refuse. The decision was, well, we'll make you guest of the nation. What does that mean? Well, wherever you go, we'll take care of your travel. You'll be escorted by military personnel. We will endeavor to make sure that wherever you're staying is the best, comfortable, most interesting, most engaging. And so under that condition, they labeled him the guest of the nation. Lafayette agrees. And so under those terms, Lafayette departs for the United States, departs France on July 13th, 1824. And between that time, the social, political, apparatus in the United States starts to kick in. What does that mean? States start to send Lafayette requests for him to visit their state. Whenever you're in town, please consider visiting, Albany or Savannah or Pennsylvania or Philadelphia or New York, And so these political, social organizations, churches, colleges, universities, all these different organizations start to really engage with Lafayette, send correspondence. State houses drafted resolutions of appreciation and resolutions of invitation. And then they effectively created what will become his schedule across this 14, 13-month tour. And of course, the Freemasons were certainly involved in that as well, and they extended him invitations to participate. And so that's really the first takeaway. We really, most Americans really don't know about this part of the tour, unfortunately, or know about Lafayette or his condition. They sort of get a sense that, or they think that, Lafayette went back to France and lived a great life and helped ferment revolution there, and that was it. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. The second takeaway, like Benjamin Franklin, like George Washington, like many other American founding fathers, Lafayette has many myths associated to Masonry and his Masonic origin. One of those, perhaps the most glaring, the most obvious, and unfortunately the most contradictory, is the fact of we don't know where his initiation occurred into Freemasonry. We believe there is a general sense of where it happened, but if you look at Masonic research around Lafayette's initiation, William Freak Gould proposed that he was initiated in a military lodge sometime in the American Revolution. The Grand Lodges of New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey make suggestions in their official histories of where he was initiated. And unfortunately, here's an example. Of course, there's a picture here of Washington at Valley Forge. That's perhaps the most the most recurring instance that I've noticed throughout the thousands of references and books that I use to compile these resources, or periodicals and books and these external sources to compile this book. And so, there's this great story of Lafayette being initiated in Valley Forge, and President George Washington served as the head of the lodge, of this ambulatory lodge, and he was the one that personally initiated Lafayette. There's no evidence of this. The Grand Lodge of New Jersey, one of their historians, not the Grand Lodge, but the historian for the Grand Lodge, when they were publishing their history, made a claim that Lafayette was initiated in Morristown or in one of these, military lodges. But when you look at the date in which they claim that occurred, well, Lafayette was back in France for a furlough for about a year, so it couldn't have been that date. But unfortunately, you see this perpetuation of these stories that happen. And so over time, every state seems to have an example of where potentially Lafayette could have been initiated. And that's one of those recurring myths. The second, I would argue, and it is the most recurring, the most abundant, the most that I saw, the most frequent, is a story or the story around Lafayette's apron, or a apron associated to Lafayette that was gifted George Washington. I'm sorry to say that the story of this apron is not necessarily true, or actually, in fact, it's not accurate. In 1904, Sidney Hayden, the origin of this story comes from a 1904 book by Sidney Hayden, who was the curator of the Masonic Temple in Philadelphia, where this apron currently resides. And Sidney said something to the effect of, this apron was given to George Washington during one of Lafayette's earlier tours. It was given to Washington at Mount Vernon. And my favorite part of it is Lafayette's wife apparently is an expert apron maker, and she's the one that made this apron. There's no record of that. There is no record of that transition. There is no record of that transfer of an apron. In the first 100 years of this story, of this time period, we have no record of this apron being associated with Lafayette. So unfortunately, it's just one of these stories, and you hate to see it. You go to a Masonic lodge, and I see an example of this apron hung up, or I see a brother wearing a replica of this apron, and unfortunately, you hate to be the bearer of bad news, saying that there's no record of this apron coming together. Within 240 or 250 correspondences between George Washington and Lafayette, and Masonry is referenced in 0 instances between those two. In other words, between all the surviving artifacts and letters between Washington and Lafayette, there is no mention of an apron. There is no mention of an apron or Lafayette or Freemasonry between these two in other sources. So, other corresponding, individuals, Washington secretaries, members of Alexander Washington 22. There is just no record of these types of stories. But they persist, right? You see these in periodicals, in newspaper journals, or newspapers and journals. You see these in Masonic and non-Masonic print, and unfortunately, there is no connection to them. Why is that important? Well, in many instances, myths around the presence of the United States and Freemasonry is very evident. When I worked on my first book, The White House and the Freemasons, my job for that book was to catalog all of the Masonic activities with the White House or presidents of the United States, vice presidents, members of the executive, branch, and the Freemasons. And what I found in many instances are these types of similar telephone game type of stories where there's a sliver or perhaps a piece of this information that is accurate, but then over time the story morphs. It changes, like the telephone game. It shifts, it evolves, and you go from George Washington had a Masonic apron in his custody, and then 150 years or 200 years later, the story evolved from George Washington's aprons from Lafayette. Lafayette's wife made it. Here's where he donated it. Oh, again, we have no record of it. And the line, that story, really doesn't hold up when you look at research or if you do any type of research. Okay. The third takeaway from the series, knowledge on Lafayette, or what we know about Lafayette and Freemasonry, almost all of it. In fact, I cataloged all of the Masonic connection from Lafayette, where we believe he was initiated, to where he died, all those records, all those files. I tried to catalog as much of those. If you put all of that in a pie chart, 95, maybe let's say 96% of all those Masonic interactions, Masonic engagements with Lafayette come from this 1824-1825 tour. If many people in the United States, or certainly most Masons, don't really know the Masonic activities of the tour, then they really don't know anything about Lafayette, or they certainly don't know a lot about Lafayette and Freemasonry. And so that was the goal of this book, to help catalog all these events, and then explain to folks what was Lafayette's engagement. And so what I found was, the best research before writing this book I could find, there was a Masonic brother named Harold V.B. Voorhees, who was very big into the Allied Masonic degrees. He was one of the I would argue, one of the co-creators of Masonic Week in Alexandria, Virginia, or Arlington, Virginia. And he discovered, or he cataloged about 20 to 25 activities. That was really good. His papers are, with the, published in different Masonic periodicals. Now, that was in 1933, 1932. He was able to compile all those sources. This book covers about 65 Masonic activities. So again, what we thought about Lafayette and Freemasonry, not necessarily the case of what we've seen in publications and written print. So Lafayette arrives in the United States in August of 1824. He leaves, as I mentioned before, in July 1824. He spends about a month in the water and then arrives in New York in August of 1824. What you'll notice during the tour is there are some consistent patterns about how he engages in the tour. The schedule is quite standard. He tends to do the following. He tends to first, whenever he goes into a state, goes to the state capitol, meets with the governor or the head representative in the state. He then meets with revolutionary veterans of 1812, tends to focus on those who served in the military. And then the third phase or wave of his tour within a state, he tends to engage with the civic societies like the Freemasons and other organizations, or like churches, or colleges or institutions or other societies. So it tends to hit that formula. And on the screen here, you'll see the first leg of his tour. The first leg effectively consisted of the Northeast part. So he stayed in New York. He arrived in New York in August 1824. He went up to Albany for a little bit, and then he effectively went up to Boston, spent a little time in Boston, went down to New York once again, went through New Jersey to Philadelphia, spend a little time in Washington, D.C. and Virginia, and that's most of 1824. Why didn't he go out further into the rest of the country? Because he was waiting for winter to end, and he was waiting for spring 1825 to start his long tour. You also got to remember, again, there's no interstate system, there's no highway system. Traveling during the winter was dangerous, especially for a 77-year-old man. And so he spent the first part of the leg in the Northeast. What was his first Masonic activity? Well, on September 11th, 1824, Lafayette is initiated into the Royal Arch and the Knights Templar. This occurs in New York City. This occurs in the Masonic Hall in New York City, and this is the first known Masonic activity that occurred during Lafayette's visit. Did he receive letters of invitation and all those things? Yes, and we have records of that where, Masonic lodges reached out to him, or Grand Lodges engaged with him to sort of coordinate his travel. But his first physical act was being initiated into the Royal Arch and the Knights Templar. And a picture you see here is of a portrait that was commissioned in 1840 by Alexandria Washington Lodge No. 22, of which I'm a member, and it depicts Lafayette in his Templar garb. The next big activity, and really an example of what we saw in newspapers, is the Grand Lodge of New York activity. So this is the big banquet about a month later. Yeah, that's right. Not a month later. It was September 20th. Where the Grand Lodge of New York held a really huge banquet, sort of going away farewell banquet, as Lafayette was moving on to travel into New Jersey. And this newspaper, the Albion newspaper in New York, is actually a really nice example and a unique example of the types of things that we saw in newspapers. So you got to remember that, number one, journalists traveled with Lafayette throughout the tour. So there is a perfect, and not perfect, but as good as it can get, in fact, a astonishingly accurate depiction of Lafayette's tour through newspapers. Journalists covered his travel wherever he went. and then republished and published these incidences across the country. And so, in certain instances, I've found letters and correspondence in North Carolina of his activities in New York. And then you can corroborate those activities because it was just so interesting. The other part or example of this, which I found really interesting, that newspapers or journalists did a very good job at describing in great detail the cultural ephemera, the activities, the material culture of the tour. So in this example, in this example here, you'll see, a depiction of what the East platform looked like, where all the dignitaries sat for Lafayette. On the right-hand side, you'll see, and I apologize if it's difficult to see here, but it is a layout, a map of where all the dignitaries from every single, Masonic lodge that participated in the event, where their worshipful masters sat, or, deputy grand masters or past grand masters. You can see the entire banquet and who the dignitaries were. So you can see how detailed an account this journalist, engaged in. A very interesting, engaging attempt. In Philadelphia, now he crossed, finishes New York, travels into Philadelphia. In Philadelphia, months before Lafayette arrives in Philadelphia, a committee of Grand Masters, past Grand Masters, is organized to determine what kind of Mason was Lafayette. Was he an ancient Mason or a modern Mason? And they actually went through an attempt to figure out what kind of Mason, where was his Masonic origin? Again, we didn't know a lot about his Masonic origin. Masons knew that he was a Mason, but they didn't really know the context or the background of his initiation. And that was back then. So, certainly the aura or the mystery of Lafayette's initiation persisted. So much so that a committee of past Grand Masters was assigned to figure this out. And unfortunately, when you go through the proceedings of the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania, you'll find that it was inconclusive. They couldn't figure out what kind of Mason he was, but they certainly allowed him to enter the Grand Lodge and participate in the Grand Lodge activities, which was basically they opened up the Grand Lodge, they allowed him to speak for a little bit, and then they closed the Grand Lodge and went to a nice banquet. And what you see here is an example of a handkerchief that depicted Lafayette's arrival into Philadelphia. I think it was the largest city in the United States at the time. You can see these arches and this huge procession. I mean, half of the city was there to welcome Lafayette during the tour. He, visited Independence Hall. He participated in all these other interesting activities. Going further south, Lafayette arrives in Washington, D.C., and from his secretary, we find some fun little instances of what happened in D.C. Lafayette's secretary, a gentleman named Auguste André Levasseur, basically took notes during the entire trip and then published these notes after the trip as a way of helping people understand the context of the travel from Lafayette and Levasseur's perspective. And one of my favorite little inserts or little parts of the tour is when the tour arrives in New York, or excuse me, in Washington, D.C., and the secretary says something to the effect of, we're about 30 minutes into the District of Columbia, and I saw nothing. It was just woods and, barren farmland. And the District of Columbia is nothing more than one street connecting the White House to the United States Capitol. When we get to the White House, I was shocked to see that only one person was at the door that greeted us. When we got into the main reception hall, I was shocked to see that the President of the United States was sitting at the same level as his cabinet secretaries, that they were all wearing just a simple, blue jacket or blue coat. None of the pomp and frills, the huge hats of Marie Antoinette or the European courts. It was just a simple, stately, and very American, as he said. It was a very American, plain outfit and very American attire. And I found that just particularly interesting. There were no Masonic activities in Washington, ironically. You'd think that there would be something, but there were no Masonic activities recorded during the visit. In Virginia, when he crosses over the Potomac River, Lafayette arrives in Alexandria, and there's a fanciful. I've had a tough time confirming this, but there's a fanciful story that Robert E. Lee was one of the individuals who helped welcome him in. He was, a junior, very, very junior officer. And, he was on the sidelines watching Lafayette arrive and travel through Alexandria. This, of course, is a depiction of what you would see. This is not technically correct. The second tomb to George Washington was not built by the time Lafayette arrived there, but this is a depiction of Washington observing this is a depiction of Lafayette observing Washington's tomb at Mount Vernon. One of the great stories here about this was Lafayette entered the tomb, the final resting place of George Washington and his family. As he came out, it was a very tearful, a very emotional experience. The reporters said something to the effect of, George Washington Parke Custis, who was the caretaker of the property at the time, after this emotional moment, Lafayette was hugging his son and the secretary, and they all came together. And then as a sort of gift to Lafayette, Custis gifted Lafayette a past master's jewel or a Masonic jewel associated to George Washington and a blue sash. And we believe that's these are the same items that you see in the William Williams portrait of George Washington that is currently in display at Alexandria, Washington 22. The story about that as well is that the sash, according to the reporters, the sash was cut up into small pieces, and Lafayette distributed the small pieces out to the children who were at that event. And the story actually gets a little bit more interesting as we progress further. Now comes 1825. It's after winter. We've got to spring, and Lafayette begins his grand tour of the 24 states. He leaves Washington, D.C., and he basically makes the tour down south. He hits Virginia Beach in Norfolk, Virginia. He travels into North Carolina, goes into South Carolina. Again, Masonic activities are occurring, cornerstone laying ceremonies, welcomes from the members that are there, gets to South Carolina, again, visits with others, goes through Georgia, goes through Alabama, crosses over or takes a steamboat over to Louisiana and New Orleans, where there's a grand Masonic activity in New Orleans, of course, a big French quarter there. So he certainly appreciated the Masonic activities there. He goes up the Mississippi River. He spends one day in Mississippi. And why is that the case? Because the state of Mississippi their state legislature never submitted an invitation to Lafayette to visit their state. So Lafayette spends one day in Mississippi. He gets back on the boat and goes up through Memphis, goes up to Tennessee, spends a little bit of time in Louisiana, goes into Indiana, goes into Kentucky, of course, very relevant for our purposes. And in Kentucky, of course, there's a nice there's a story. I believe it's in Kentucky. There's a story about a very large cake that is produced for Lafayette. The cake is so beautiful, it's so huge that Lafayette refuses to cut this cake, and it just basically follows him for a couple days. And Lafayette's like, I'm not interested in cutting this cake. And there's a humorous little anecdote associated to this, but it starts off, there's a nice banquet at the Masonic Hall. Masons at the Masonic Hall, members, I believe, of this lodge were also participating in that event. On the way up to Ohio, on the Ohio River, tragedy strikes. On midnight, on this boat, on the steamboat hits a shoal or some type of obstruction. They don't really know what caused it. And the boat begins to sink. And so everyone is getting out of the boat. They fortunately secure Lafayette out. Everyone survives, but it begins to rain, and the 77-year-old man, they secure a mattress off of the boat, and they basically Lafayette spends the night on the floor on the ground near the river, and someone's holding an umbrella while he sleeps in the rain on a mattress while the rest of the boat is sinking. Gone are his certificates, his aprons, his monies, his everything that we have of the tour so far is underneath the Ohio River. So unfortunately, there is a very little record associated to the tour up to this point from Lafayette's own perspective, because it's all destroyed all under the Ohio River. So if you're curious to know where George Washington's Masonic jewel is, it's currently somewhere in the Mississippi River, and you're more than welcome to join me in trying to hunt for it. He gets to Ohio, and just like Mississippi, Ohio doesn't refuse, but they choose not to send him an invitation. Why is that? Because during his brief stint in Washington, D.C., representatives from Ohio in Congress vote against paying Lafayette back pay owed to him for the revolution. And so, as a point of embarrassment, the state legislature chooses not to extend to him an invitation to come to Ohio. But he still visits Ohio. Why is that? Because the Freemasons of Ohio were the ones that extended the invitation. And so on their invitation, Lafayette arrives in Cincinnati and spends some time with Freemasons there. And to add perhaps a fun little point to that, the the governor of Ohio was also a Mason and participated in that fraternal visit in Cincinnati. After Ohio, he gets to Pennsylvania. He goes up to Niagara Falls, and then he crosses over through New York to get to Boston. And right about this time, there's a little bit of urgency because we're getting to the largest Masonic activity that occurs during the trip, which is the cornerstone laying ceremony for the Bunker Hill Monument. And so the first monument to Bunker Hill was manufactured or produced or funded by Freemasons. It was a wooden structure. And so the decision was, let's make it more of a stone structure. And so they coordinated so they can have Lafayette participate in the cornerstone ceremony for that event. And that was certainly the largest Masonic activity at the time. Grand lodges throughout the Northeast visited, assembled and gathered in Boston to participate in that ceremony. And then Lafayette spends the rest of his time basically in the Northeast. He goes up to New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine. He comes back down into New Jersey and New York. And then he spends the last part of his tour, September 1825, back in Washington, D.C. And then a boat is chartered to travel to take him back to France. So that is the very short, brief stint on the tour with some interesting little Masonic connections to it. Number 4. Lafayette's views on Freemasonry, or Freemasonry reinforced Lafayette's political views. Now, I jokingly say I love my type of research in Freemasonry because we often say we don't talk about politics or religion. And so I write about politics, and I'm working on religion right now. And so it's one of those opportunities to see that there's actually a lot of politics in Freemasonry, especially during Lafayette's age. And so what are examples of that? Well, what I noticed is Lafayette almost always talked about Freemasonry and politics in Masonic speeches or in Masonic addresses or whatever you would call them, discussions or remarks at Masonic events. He often referred to this gentleman that you see pictured here, General Raphael de Rigo, and he would often comment on the plight of General Rigo, the issues about being a Freemason back in Europe. To paraphrase, he basically was saying that, being a Freemason in the United States is a gift compared to being a Freemason in Europe, where politics and Freemasonry don't necessarily align, and you could be killed for being a Freemason. And he uses the example of Raphael de Rigo. Raphael de Rigo helped effectively turn or kick out the Spanish government for 3 years. He supported a revolution that evicted the Spanish monarchy for 3 years. So for 3 years, Spain was a republic. And ironically, it's the French government, the French monarchy, now back in power in France, helps the Spanish monarchy reclaim power in Spain. So after those 3 years, the French helped the Spanish king get back into power. And so here are some remarks that Lafayette mentions about Rigo, but generally speaking, the idea was that, the Masonic institutions in the United States should be grateful, or the Masons should be grateful that Freemasonry in the United States isn't seen in a negative context. It appears that there's a negative connotation to Freemasonry in Europe, according to Lafayette. There's also this other thing that I've noticed, and I see it in speeches, I see it in how we communicate as Freemasons, and much of my research is on this, on Freemasonry's impact in American culture. We often tend to focus on us Masons when we talk about Freemasonry, when we talk about how do we market Freemasonry. We often tend to focus on statesman, soldier Freemasons, this idea of individuals who either served their country as a president or a politician, those who served in some military capacity, and then those who were Freemasons. Consider the example of the presidents of the United States. Harry Truman, Rough Rider Teddy Roosevelt, first president of the United States, commander of the armies George Washington. These are all classic examples of the statesman, soldier, Freemason. And why is that the case? Well, to my last point, I believe that it is clearly evident in the research, clearly evident in newspapers, in proceedings, and all these things, that Freemasonry operated in the public sphere. Freemasonry had a public role. It was a public institution. Now, what does that mean? We make the claim, or we erroneously make the claim, that Freemasonry is a secret society. This cannot be further from the truth. Freemasonry is I argue that Freemasonry is a society in which its initiations are secret. Everything else has been operating in this public sphere for the last 200 years. Here's an example. Tell me a secret society in which its publications or its proceedings are printed for general use or general consumption. The public can access proceedings. You can access proceedings of any state and see how Masons voted, how they distributed their monies, how they assisted widows or orphans, how they engaged with the public. Tell me a secret society that publishes its notices in newspapers. Going back to the late 18th century, you found notices for in regular towns across the United States. You found notices on who was elected to become worshipful master for the year. There are notices in public records and in newspapers of how a Masonic lodge blackballed an individual, and they even gave you the reason for why they were blackballed. In the public sphere, they gave you that information. There's this idea of, Masons don't really talk about the ritual. Well, what is a cornerstone laying ceremony? Here again is another example of Masons performing a public service, of dedicating the first stone of a public building. We don't tell Masons, we don't tell non-Masons, okay, everyone in this town, get out for an hour and 30 minutes while we perform this private ceremony. We actually bring the public into the ceremony. We talk about what the ritual is. We talk about what the plumb is. We circumambulate. We do all these things that we claim that we do not do. There are many examples as to why this is important. And there's many examples in contemporary time. Why did Lafayette talk about Freemasonry as a public institution? Why did Masonic lodges open up their space to have reporters come in and write down all these speeches that were made by past Grand Masters and Worshipful Masters and members of the fraternity during Lafayette's visit? Because the fraternity was inherently a public institution. It was before the years of Medicare, Medicaid, and the things that we have now, like insurance and all this stuff. Our fraternities, or fraternities like the Freemasons, served the public good through that capacity. They helped set up charitable arms. They helped set up Masonic homes. They did all the things that many state and companies do today, but they just did it 150 years before they did those things. So I certainly understand and appreciate why Lafayette would see the fraternity as a public institution, and see why we talked about people like George Washington, like Benjamin Franklin, because they were a form of, they were in the public. It's also another example of why we don't see those types of individuals anymore. People lament, Freemasons lament, I wish we had more presidents who were Freemasons, or I wish we had senators, congressmen, or local members of local town bureaus who are, town councils, who are Masons. Well, back when the fraternity operated as a public institution, those individuals tended to come in and support the institution. When we, quote unquote, became more secretive, then we lost that public approach, we lost that public interest, and therefore those individuals are no longer coming. So to wrap up that sort of statement, Field of Dreams, I think, had it best. When you build it, they will come. When you build a public institution, the public individuals will come and operate in that space. Last but not least, I believe, and this has been a very interesting and exciting part of my research in the last couple of months, I believe Lafayette's tour exacerbated anti-masonry, because only a couple of years later, right, Captain Morgan in New York is captured, and we believe, at least according to media reports, somehow Freemasonry was involved. And so I make the case that I think, unfortunately, Lafayette's tour exacerbated already existing anti-Masonic sentiments that permeated throughout the culture at the time. When you have newspaper reporters covering all these Masonic activities, all these great things that were said by Masons, all this, these public processions and presidents and congressmen and town officials are traveling to visit Lafayette, to wear Masonic aprons, to process in Masonic processions, to participate in cornerstone ceremonies, all these things during the tour, it creates a sort of backlash, or the sentiments, it perpetuates these sentiments that will eventually erupt 3 or 4 years later in the anti-Masonic period. There are great examples of the book of people who will eventually become very active the anti-Masonic movement, participating in Masonic events just a couple of years before. And some of them, like Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Marshall, who during the anti-Masonic convention in the 1830s states outright, I was not really active in Freemasonry, for most of the time. I sort of stopped after George Washington died. Well, John Marshall was a past Grand Master of Virginia, and during Lafayette's tour, 5 or 4 years before, the anti-Masonic convention, was in Norfolk, Virginia, and was eager to attend Lafayette's event at Norfolk Lodge. He was, in fact, so eager that he kicked the poor worshipful master out, and by virtue of him being a past Grand Master, said, "I'm going to be the one that welcomes Lafayette into this lodge, not you. By virtue of me being a past Grand Master of Virginia, I will do the honors of welcoming Lafayette into the lodge." So I think there's a lot of interesting insights there, and I'm still working on how to provide examples of how I believe it is the case that the tour exacerbated anti-Masonry. I think that is my last. Yes, that is my last slide. So with that, I will pause and I will turn it back to you, Worshipful Brother John, or Worshipful Brother Brian. And I thank you again for the opportunity to speak. I look forward to answering any questions anyone may have within the time allotted. Thank you so much.
Great. Worship Brother Chris, thank you so much. I will take the screen back if you don't mind. Excellent presentation. Thank you very much. Very, very engaging stories. Obviously, you spent a tremendous amount of time in research, putting all of this together. Greatly appreciative of you for that work. You mentioned the Morgan affair. That was definitely going to be one of my recent questions. To talk more about that, I was very curious to know what you touched on, and I'm sure there's more of it in your book. What role that played. Before I jump into that and a couple other questions, Darren, you have your hand up. So if anybody has a question, this is the time to put your virtual hand up, or speak when appropriate, or enter your comment in the chat box, and I'll call on you and we'll go through one by one. But first, I was curious, you mentioned there was a past Grand Master committee that was in charge with doing some research on his history right? What did they discover? And it baffles me that, did anyone ask him his Masonic origins, and how is there no record of that? And I'm sure you're probably confused too, but nothing with the past Grand Master Committee.
Yeah, so I was actually, I would use the word shocked. I was shocked that they couldn't figure this out. Yeah, the according to the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania's proceedings, the committee basically came back and said we could not find any evidence to support whether he was an ancient York Mason or a modern. And again, this is coming from a Grand Lodge where I believe it was, if my memory serves me right, Benjamin Franklin never received a Masonic funeral because he was a modern, and I believe, or vice versa. I believe he was a modern, and so they had a lot of issues related to this fight between ancients and moderns in Freemasonry. So yeah, it was very interesting. So I thought, what would happen? Well, if the committee was, unable to determine what happened, they basically just threw up their arms and said, we're just going to welcome him regardless because these different Grand Lodges already did so. They already welcomed him. They already engaged with him in Masonic discussion. And so they effectively just let him visit and let him participate. I believe there was a really rich vein in part of your question, which I did not get a chance to speak about, which I'm happy to answer, which was, did Lafayette say anything about his connection to Freemasonry during the tour? Well, curiously, there was only one mention of Lafayette mentioning his Masonic origin, and it occurred in Tennessee. The Grand Lodge of Tennessee was holding a banquet for Lafayette during his visit, and I believe it was the Grand Secretary wrote in the proceedings of the Grand Lodge that at the banquet, Lafayette mentioned that he was initiated into Freemasonry before the American Revolution. Which means if you do the calculus of when he was serving as a junior officer in France before he comes to the United States, he would have most likely been 16 or 17 years old and been he was most likely initiated in a ambulatory or a military lodge in a town called Metz, Metz or Mets, depending on the pronunciation. And there is a record of him visiting that lodge or them acknowledging him as a Mason, but we just don't have the definitive proof of if he was initiated at that time at that lodge. So that's one of those little curiosities that we find.
Interesting.
I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, it is. Was there any point in your research that you just thought, you know what, he really wasn't a Mason initiated? Did that ever
No,
cross
no,
your
not
mind?
at all. Not at all. The way that he engaged the fraternity, the way that they knew about his
Yeah.
Freemasonry, I don't think he would have. I certainly don't think he would have been. That was a lie. I will note, however, that also, after the Revolutionary War and before his visit to the United States, there are some records to notice that he did participate in some Masonic activities back in France. So, there's a clear record certainly of him being a Mason.
Okay, great, great. Excellent. Jan, I'm going to go ahead and call you first. Darren, Gerald, if you don't mind. Jan, go ahead. You're muted, brother. Let me unmute you. Brother, I'm sorry. I don't know if you can hear me, but you are muted. Can you please unmute yourself? Let me see if I can help you out.
Yeah. So,
There we
what
go.
made him known in the United States? I thought in his earlier years, he was an architect and he laid out Washington, the city of
Uh,
Washington, and the
you're
Great Wall. What made
no,
him?
you're thinking of Pierre L'Enfant, not Lafayette.
Okay.
Pierre
What?
L'Enfant was an officer in the
You're right.
Revolution. He was initiated, we believe we have a record of him being initiated in Holland Lodge
No,
number
you're
6
right.
in New York. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. What was Lafayette's first name?
He was Gilbert de Mortier. Well,
Okay.
actually, he has a very long name, but
Okay. Yeah.
his name was Gilbert de Mortier, the Marquis de Lafayette.
But Lafayette did visit the United States in his younger days, or
His
not?
visit his first visit to the United States came when he was about 16, 17 years old when he enlisted in the Continental Army.
Thank you. Yeah.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Answer my question. Good.
Thank you, brother.
My pleasure. And by the way, the story as a Freemason historian, on Washington, D.C. and the history of the District of Columbia. The story that Lafayette laid out the district in Masonic fashion has no basis in fact. It's a nice story that fun Masons tell, but there's no record of him doing that. In fact, L'Enfant never finished his plans. George Washington fired L'Enfant. And in great fury, L'Enfant took his plans and basically said, I'm not interested in sharing these plans with you. He took and kept his plans. It was Andrew Ellicott, the assistant surveyor, who relayed out the plans according to L'Enfant's original description.
Yep.
So L'Enfant was a bit of a not nice guy.
Thank you, brother.
Was L'Enfant a Mason?
I apologize for taking all this time, worshipful Brother Brian. L'Enfant, we only have a record of L'Enfant being initiated as an entered apprentice. We don't have any record of him being initiated as a fellow craft or master mason. And that is also consistent with L'Enfant's history, where he never completed anything he was assigned to do.
Yes.
Great. Thank you, brother. Brother Darren, go ahead.
Great. Worshipful Brother Chris, that was a fantastic talk. You're right in my wheelhouse here with the history and Freemasonry stuff, so I appreciate that. Yeah, I originally was thinking about some things that you touched on right at the end, so that kind of threw me for a little bit of a loophole here. But what do you think? No, I got two questions. One's really quick, because how many aprons did Lafayette have? It seems like they pop up all over the place at lodges. I visited a lodge up in New York City, Holland Lodge #4, I think. They say they have one. I think we say we have one here at Lexington Lodge #1 that's at the Grand Lodge. It seems like he had a whole bunch of aprons, but that's just a quick question.
Yeah, so I always jokingly say that if Lafayette brought all the stuff that he gave to Masonic lodges with him during the tour, he sort of had a second boat to bring all that stuff over. There's no way. What I think happened is, I think a brother of the lodge had an apron, or it was their own apron, and then, hey, I'm coming in, like happens in, right now. I mean, you would go to the lodge and say, hey, listen, I didn't bring an apron. Do you have one to borrow? They'll then have him wear that apron for the duration of the visit, and then Lafayette will give the apron back, and bam, zoom, we now have a Lafayette apron. That also happens with swords. That also happens with chairs. Lafayette sat in this chair. Well, congratulations. Now it's a Lafayette chair. The price of the chair just quadrupled, and you have a Lafayette chair. So my goal in this book was not to figure out what is accurate or what is true. I can't confirm provenance of all these items. I'd probably never be done with the book, but yes, that there is a story. It's sort of tough telling, the sitting deputy Grand Master of Pennsylvania, hey, that apron you have may not necessarily be a Lafayette true apron, but nevertheless, if it is, great. It's not my job to confirm provenance.
Yeah, that's kind of what I thought, and actually, Worshipful Brother Bizak kind of suggested that too. It was like, hey, these were given. But my last question, or my real question, actually has to do with what you touched on at the end as well, as this idea of Freemasonry as a public institution.
Oh yes,
and I'm sure you've read Bullock's book, Revolutionary Brotherhood. That kind of touches on that real early in the founding of the nation, where it was like, hey, Freemasonry was an institution that, hey, the movers and shakers are joining. All the guys that were involved in the revolution were members of the fraternity and all this, and we might want to get into that. And at some point in time, that sort of devolved, and that there was no public face on Freemasonry, and I wonder if at some point in time, probably in the 20th century, where Masonry grew so fast, this is something that Worshipful Brother Bizak also harkens on, that guys just didn't understand the purpose of Freemasonry and turned it secret because they couldn't explain what they needed. They couldn't explain it. Do you think that there's something to that? And when do you think that, if so, when may have that have even started?
Yeah, so part one of that is, thank you so much, Brother Dan. So part of that, I'll answer the first part. your earlier statement first. I continue to see evidence that the fraternity was not the decision maker in terms of why there's this claim that Freemasonry was the reason why we have the American Revolution, all this stuff. There's no evidence of that. It's a fun story. It's a compelling story when we say that Freemasons helped establish this country. Yes, but you can also make the claim that these were all members of the same speaking society, and they were part of the polemic society, and they were part of the Washington Benevolent Society, all these other institutions and organizations. What Freemasonry did was it made the discussion around the liberal arts and sciences, mathematics, science, more palatable and more relatable to a general audience. It brought in people who did not have a formal education. It brought in all these individuals. So, the fact that, can you make the claim that all Freemasons helped? No. Less than half signed the Declaration of Independence. Less than half were, signers of the Constitution. Or that's right, ratify the Constitution. So I struggle when people mention that because there's very little evidence, or the evidence does not weigh that support. The second thing, which is something that I'm very, very interested in dealing with, the way that I say it is, look at what the anti-Masonic newspapers wrote about the fraternity. Look at what newspaper reporters wrote the fraternity. Look at what society thought about the fraternity. What you will see is, going from 1800s all the way around to after the Civil War, you see that the fraternity was a public institution. It engaged in the public discussion. It engaged in the public discourse. It served as a place for people to go to help support their families if they were destitute, to set up Masonic homes if they were supportive, to be a institution where people can engage. After the Civil War, when fraternities became really, part of the fraternity shifted over to helping veterans. And there's no surprise that the largest fraternity in the United States at the time was the Grand Army of the Republic, the Grand Army of the Republic, GAR, because it served as a VA when there was no VA. And there were also thousands of different fraternities popping up throughout the United States. And so at the turn of the 20th century, into the Gilded Age, into the turn of the 20th century, we find all these fraternities and associations. How does Freemasonry compete with these organizations? Well, we say, look at all this mysticism. Look at all this interesting stuff that you're not going to get in the Independent Order of Oddfellows, that you're not going to get at the GAR, you're not going to get at these other organizations. The Masons, the leaders of the organizations throughout the country, pivoted to say, yes, you can join all these organizations, but here's what the fraternity does for us. Here are the principles, the values, the ritual, the lectures, all these things that you don't get when you become a member of the Temperance League, but you get it in Freemasonry. And so that shift over time became a very noticeable effect. They started to talk about new advancements in Freemasonry, and it also came with Egyptology and this great wave of interest in Egypt and mysticism and Arabic cultures and East Asian cultures, because it was a way for the fraternity to go, how are we going to differentiate ourselves between the GAR and the IOF and all these other organizations? Let's focus on mysticism. And here's the funny part of that. If you notice, all this mysticism is now becoming really popular in the United States at the turn of the 20th century. You now get the Shriners and all these fun parts of Freemasonry, right? Because now they're thinking, well, wait a minute, this used to be a public institution, and now you've made it into mysticism. And so the Shrine comes in and says, well, we want to bring back some levity and some fun and keep people in. And so that's why you see the introduction of the Shrine and all these sort of fun-based organizations. When you take a step back, the fraternity as a structural institution starts to make a lot of sense when you start to read how the public reacted to it. So, Brother Dan, there's a lot more there, but I hope that helped answer your question. I'm not interested in creating a new field of Masonic research, but one of the things that I'm very much curious about, which I see in terms of observation, is that there is a pendulum swinging of, what we call mystic Freemasonry and what we call fraternal Freemasonry, small f Freemasonry, which is, let's go out there and do some charity work and help out the community. And then the pendulum swings over and let's talk about mysticism and why we're doing this and ritual. And I think it is a pendulum. I think it waxes and wanes. Sometimes it becomes more interesting, sometimes not. And what I have tend to found is things in the zeitgeist now, the Masonic zeitgeist tends to swing a little bit more towards mysticism because people are attempting to find some value in what it is. The baby boomer generation, the generation of the 60s and 70s, it was the other way. It was about being a good person and helping out the community the pendulum swings to, it's not a bad thing, by the way. I'm not saying that these are bad things. These operate in both spheres. And so I'm very curious about that in a political or in a historical context. When was it this way? When was it the other way? How did it shift over? And I think we're still seeing the effects of that. So, Brother Gerald, I will be happy to engage with you in the future, and
Yeah.
I'm happy to open up the floor to other questions just to respect everyone else.
Brother Chris, thank you very much. My question is, as I read stuff that was printed locally, you said that his ship sank. And if I understand right, he was in Lexington before he came to Covington and then Cincinnati. Do you know which river his ship sank on? Was it the Ohio or the Licking?
It was the Ohio River. I apologize. I don't know exactly where it is, but you can test me on this. You can go online and find the date yourself, or the time and where it was. There's actually now a marker placed at the riverfront where they believe Lafayette likely spent the night on the floor, while someone was holding the thing. So I apologize.
Okay.
I just don't have it on me to answer your question.
Okay.
Brother Bruce, I'm sorry, we're running out on time, Bruce. I'm really sorry. We have time for one more question because Worship Brother Chris has to go to another engagement. So please forgive me for interrupting. But I do want to give the last question. I do want to give the last question to Worship Brother Bizak.
Chris, excellent presentation. Thank you for your time on this. One quick question. Did you run across any confirmation that Lafayette had attended a lodge during the Revolution when he was here, other
No,
than
sir.
tour?
No, sir. I don't have any confirmation that Lafayette attended the lodge. I don't have any written confirmation from him to even refer to say, I'm so pleased to be back in New Jersey. The last time I was here, I was in the lodge. There was none of that. I couldn't find any of that. Now, that doesn't mean that he didn't. It's just that I can't, in terms of Masonic research or research in general, I only write in my books what I can find references to. And so, just like yourself, in terms of stuff when you're doing research, I wish I had a record to confirm that, but unfortunately I couldn't.
Well, I know you run across a lot of different things after you finish writing too, and you wish you had it. Do you have a book called Lafayette in Kentucky?
Yes.
You do have this one?
Yeah.
Great. I was going to make sure
I had
you
a chance
got
to
it.
go through. I appreciate that.
Interesting
Yeah.
things in it.
I very much appreciate that. Yeah. No, I spent 3 years going through compiling this book, and just like my White House and the Freemasons, I spent 5 years on that book going through the Library of Congress, National Archives, every presidential library, every Masonic resource I can find online. The building behind me, the Columbia Archives, has granted me access to a lot of materials that you can find online. I'm not sure if Brent Morris is on the call, but once in a while, even Brent has to reach out to me, say, "Hey, Chris, can you access these databases? Because I don't have, access to this stuff." So doing real Masonic research, you could spend 3 weeks pouring through records to find one page, one paragraph of something that is like, that's it. That's the diamond in the rough. And so, the book that the Brother Lafayette book effectively is just a compilation of all those Masonic resources with Lafayette: newspapers, diaries, journals, extracts from the Library of Congress, anything that I could find.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you so much. And it's good to see you, John, as
You
always.
do. You do.
Brother John is my senior here. He's the second vice president of the Philadelphia Society. So I always enjoy any opportunity I can spend with John, virtual or perhaps in person. So I thank you, Worshipful Brother and Worshipful Brother Brian, for the opportunity of being here with tonight.
Indeed. Well, Worshipper Chris, we thank you as well. Great presentation. I know you said you have to head off, so we'll finish some closing items here for this presentation. But thank you again very much. And anybody that has an interest in furthering this thought, Chris has a book out, and I strongly recommend that you go check it out. He had put the link in the chat, so please go find it. We will also be sending out information regarding his book about Lafayette in our updated e-blast that goes out when this video is replayed on YouTube. So you'll get that in your inbox as well. So Chris, thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great day, all.
You too. All right, our next Masonic education will be on December 23rd at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. And I believe we have Worship Brother Chris Lasik who will be presenting. John Bizak, do you have any comments regarding that? Is that correct?
I do. Chris, or Chad was with us. I don't know if he's still here, but his presentation next month, topic on it is experiencing the holidays as a Freemason. And Chad is an Illinois Freemason. He's always engaging. He's spoken to Rubicon before, so I would encourage everyone to put it on their calendar, and you'll receive an invitation to that, of course.
Yeah, indeed. Chad, not Chris. My apologies. All right, brothers. For those of you who attended our festive board, we thank you as usual. And we finally do have the pictures that you saw in the opening preamble to our presentation tonight available online on our website. You can go to RubiconMasonicSociety.com on the homepage. You'll be able to click a button and go and see all of those photos there. We hope you enjoy. So with that being said, we do have last year's presentation available on YouTube. The one we did this year will hopefully be done soon, whenever I can get it done for you all. So please be patient, and we'll share that with you very soon. For any of you that may not be aware, Worship Brother Bizak here has a website with a tremendous amount of Masonic content on it, thecraftsman.org. Strongly recommend you take a look at that. Plenty to browse through, books, papers, commentaries, etc. I think you'll find it very, very enjoyable for your Masonic education. And on that note, Worship Brother Bizak, since I called you out, would you mention a few words, please, about the Philadelphia Society?
Sure. Philadelphia Society, brother, was founded in 1928, and today is an International Masonic Research Society, and it's the oldest independent research society in North America. It was started to serve the needs of those who seek a deeper insight into the history and the rituals and symbols, as well as just spreading Masonic light. And if you want to learn more about it, you can follow the link that's on the slide there. I'll post a link in the chat box, and if you have questions, I'll be glad to answer them for you. Just give me a call or send me an email.
Great. Thank you. Brethren, are there any other final comments of any kind tonight before we close it out?
Brother Brian, can I
Yes.
show this one thing? As per my chat, I got this on an auction, but I hope this will show up. Nope. That was a token that was minted by the French government on the 100th anniversary of Lafayette's death in 1934. Somehow I received it in an auction that I won the bid on, but I'm hoping that our local Cincinnati Lafayette will display it and guard it for me. So thank you very much.
Thank you for sharing. Thank you. Worship Brother Alan Martin, will you please do the honors of closing us out, sir?
Brothers, Grand Architect of the universe, creator and provider of all things, we thank you for this occasion and time we have spent here together this evening. As we prepare to close our meeting, we ask that you bless us with the perpetual awareness of the principles instilled by our craft and work to fortify our abilities to be just and upright. Let us always be aware of the blessings we have received, and from where those blessings emanate. These things we ask in your holy name. Amen.
So mote be. Thank
Be.
you. Brethren, our next presentation, as mentioned at the outset, is December 23rd, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. We know it's the holidays, so if you can spare some time away from your family, maybe you'll want to spare time away from your family. Join us on the virtual education on that Monday night. And as always, brothers, thank you so much. Please be safe. We have a lot to be thankful for. Enjoy your holidays with your family, and we will see you on the 23rd. So with that being said, may we always be happy to meet, sorry to part, and happy to meet again, brethren. Thank you. Have a wonderful evening.